When Donald Trump came down that escalator and the media, something snapped in their brain. You guys could all feel it. Something changed. And they went from just having a liberal bias to, I believe, being weaponized against conservative Americans, weaponized against people who think the Constitution's pretty good, weaponized to acknowledge the truth that this is the least racist, most multicultural society in the history of the world. And all of a sudden, thank you. And then all of a sudden, overnight, it seemed like everything about America was horrible. And this was all people in conservative media, people who obsess over conservative politics. We've all kind of had that thought that there's a lot of people on the left who really genuinely don't like this country very much. A lot of them are these Hollywood celebrities that pop off all the time. I'm from Hollywood, so I know it all too well. But there's something happened with Trump. And it was almost too much. In fact, it was too much. This was the Shakespearean protesting too much. Because the narrative why Trump won was very clear, and they acted like there was no narrative why he won. He won because as a candidate, he presented the most coherent slate of ideas I'd ever heard in all my time following politics. They were so clear. Borders are necessary. Without a border, you don't have a nation. All of our trade deals stink. Rip up NAFTA. We're in too many wars. We're losing too much blood and treasure. The media is the enemy. The enemy. The fake news is the enemy of the people. I disavow all political violence for any Soros-funded freaks who are watching this live stream. You have to be clear on that stuff. But the fake news is the enemy of the people. And he had nailed one thing after the next. All of his instincts were spot on. And you go back to the beginning. He predicted cancel culture. He predicted it. He predicted where it was going to go. Because you saw in the famed Charlottesville hoax, you guys remember the Charlottesville hoax? Where he said they were fine neo-Nazis or whatever, which of course he never said. Broken down in the book very early on. I explain in full detail. About 1 minute after he said there were fine people at the march in Charlottesville over the statues on both sides. The people wanted the monuments down, the people wanted the monuments up. About a minute later, he said, not the neo-Nazis, we disavow them totally, not good people, okay? But then he continued, and he said, once you start erasing this stuff, who's coming next? It's going to be Washington, Jefferson, big slave owners, major slave owners. Are they going to get canceled too? I'm paraphrasing but it's virtually what I just said. And the quotes are directly in the book. And when the media continued to push this narrative, even when they knew it was false, and one great example of this is CNN's Jake Tapper, who is a fake neutral guy, but is an extreme left-wing guy. And his wife used to work for Planned Parenthood. He did a whole segment on Trump's penis at one point during the campaign. That is not a joke, as our current president might say. He actually reported that Trump had given the full context. He had said neo-Nazis are not fine people. He never said that. But still, they talked him into continuing to push the lie, continuing to push the smear. And I was starting to think, wait a minute, something going on here. This is different. This isn't liberal bias. This is weaponized fake news. This is where the news is being used as an arm of the globalist Democrat, and eventually, we're going to get to this in a second, the corporate establishment. This is the pattern that's happening. There is not an area in American life at this time that is not being politicized. This is what is new and what came out under Trump. I'm trying to figure out what are the dots. How are these things? What changed? Why did this change? And I believe there's a reason why this changed, and it was actually because of the profit motive. And to think it's actually that simple is probably a surprise to many of you guys. You think these are people that are ideologically on the left? They were always ideologically on the left. That hasn't changed. They've been on the left since Bernie Goldberg wrote about a book called Bias over 20 years ago. He identified it. My pals at Newsbusters have been documenting every day, example after example after example for years. It's so clear the media is left of center. But what changed was Donald Trump was a threat to their business model. Donald Trump was a threat to the things that they wanted to do on a global level. Let me be specific. And I'll take the current news cycle as an example, which what's been the big focus. It's been this Wuhan lab leak. All of a sudden, a year after that theory was out, and Dr. Fauci was saying there's no chance. PolitiFact was saying it's a conspiracy theory, pants on fire rating. Facebook not just banning the content, literally throwing you off the platform if you sought to advance even a debate on the topic of the Wuhan lab, whether or not the creepy lab that no one has access to and no one can investigate, that is a mile away from where they're selling the pangolin, the undercooked bat, that maybe had to do with the giant pandemic, and no one can check on it aside from who? Who's the only place I could check on? The World Health Organization. Just a coincidence. World Health Organization, the WHO, is the only place that was allowed to check on it, which is a subsidiary of the Beijing Communist Chinese Party. So with all of those dots, still the media was so uncurious about where this pandemic came from. And I refer to it as they were on Team Pangolin. They wanted it to be the pangolin and not the lab. They wanted the origins of the virus to be the pangolin. Now why? Joe Biden wants it to be the pangolin because if it's the lab, then Trump was right, because Trump suggested it could have been the lab. Mike Pompeo was right, because he said it could have been the lab. Tom Cotton was right, because he said it could have been the lab. They didn't want those things. So Biden's on Team Pangolin. Now, the entertainment class, the media class, they all wanted to be the pangolin too, because of their extensive business in China. And of course, Dr. Fauci, who funded it, is desperately hoping it's the pangolin. It has to be. Because if it's the lab, then Fauci is potentially indirectly, some of you would say directly, I'm going to say indirectly responsible for the pandemic. So he's praying for it to be the lab too. But why wouldn't the media investigate? This is the biggest story in 20 years, biggest story since 9/11, this pandemic, the whole world shutting down. We're all changing our behavior. So everyone is rooting for it to be the pangolin and not the lab. But this connects deeply to what I connect in the book, is that the media outlets were desperate for their China business model not to be interrupted. NBC News. NBC News is not NBC News. NBC News is part of NBC Comcast Universal. You guys remember John Cena last week, the guy the wrestler who hits people over the head with a folding chair? And actually is kind of one of the biggest wussies I've ever seen. You see the video of him? Unbelievable, who a guy who could lift 7 million pounds over his head, but he gives a sniveling apology to the fascist regime of China because he had mucked it up when he had called Taiwan a country, which it is. But China has a one China policy, which means they don't recognize Taiwan as a country. And he's opening a movie called Fast and Furious 1 Million, whatever it is. And the 1 millionth Fast and Furious is going to open in China. Who distributes Fast and Furious? Universal Pictures. NBC, Comcast, Universal. So you're trusting the newsroom of NBC to even raise questions that could potentially cut into the bottom line of Universal, which just opened a theme park in Beijing 2 weeks ago. 2 weeks ago, they opened a Beijing theme park. Now you start seeing why the reporters are not asking any questions. ABC News. ABC News is what? ABC, anyone know? Disney. A lot of business in China, Disney, right? Remember the end of Mulan where they were thanking China? They thanked the area in Xinjiang where they actually have concentration camps, where Muslims are actually interned in concentration camps today on planet Earth. And Disney thanked that city. So you think ABC News is going to start looking into the origins of this pandemic? Think there's any chance you're going to do that? The star of the book is arguably Michael Bloomberg, Mini Mike, as Trump would call him. Mini Mike is actually Mega Mike, and he is not to be underestimated. Well, you can underestimate him in some ways, but he's not to be fully underestimated when it comes to his business prowess and power. He's worth $50 billion, and Bloomberg dwarfs any major news outlet we've talked about so far, dwarfs it. It's probably 5-10 times the revenue of a Fox News or a CNN. It's probably got more journalists than the New York Times and CNN and Fox combined. And they have more access maybe than any other American publication to China, the Chinese market. They sell a financial product. Most of their money is made from these things called terminals. They're very expensive. And it is the filter, it is the lens. If you're looking at financial news, you're getting it through Bloomberg's filter. And because they've got the most access to China, which is one of the biggest markets, and they've got the most journalists. And so Bloomberg, I documented this and I found it sitting right out there on Chinese propaganda websites, was flying with his top personnel, top vice presidents, executives, his eventual campaign manager. Remember when he ran for president for 3 months? They were all flying, editors-in-chief, flying over to Beijing, meeting literally with propagandists, the propagandists in China, and he'd come back with sweetheart deals. No one in American media raises these questions, or very few people do. Very rarely, and it comes and goes very quickly. Why? Because at Bloomberg, if you're a journalist, he might be your boss. If not, he could be your boss next time when you switch gears, when you switch jobs. Do you think Michael Bloomberg is going to report accurately on China? Of course not. And we have actual evidence because he is rich enough and bold enough and probably crazy enough where he actually flat out says it, that they are going to contort their coverage in order to make sure they have access to China. Now you connect all these dots. Biden, the Democrats, the anti-Trump crowd, Fauci, ABC, NBC, Bloomberg. Let me go one further, and I know Bill wants to get into this, so I won't spoil it all. But another one of the villains of the book is a lady named Laurene Powell Jobs. She is Steve Jobs' widow. And I'll leave it there for now because I know we're going to get into it in a bit. She funds maybe a dozen, maybe more left-wing news outlets, including The Atlantic, but others that are much less known and much more insidious. All of her money comes from Disney and Apple. So even if she doesn't have a China bureau, she's getting all her money from China. So this is why we missed the pandemic. This is the true story of the last year. And the media covered up not just out of Trump hatred, which of course they want Trump to lose, but the corporate media has taken over our media class, and they are misinforming you on virtually every story at the moment.